Dragon Age 2 is definitely the odd game out in the Dragon Age franchise, and no one is shy about admitting it. The only real question seems to be how forgiving a reviewer is of what the developers were trying to do with what they had. But that's not what we're here to do today, although with any luck at some point it will be. No, this is the second part of a video series diving into gay-male relationships in Dragon Age, moving chronologically now to the second game in the series. We start out naturally as a male Hawk, and choose Warrior as our class for reasons that will become apparent momentarily. This means Carver dies, but we replace him quickly with Aveline and build our little party. Aveline and our sister Bethany make good starting companions, and really shove the game's theme of lost family and found family in the player's face. There are a couple other companions we should talk about to begin with. Our female romanceable companions are Meryl and Isabella, two characters who can appear briefly in the first Dragon Age game, and who present very different perspectives on the player's potential narrative choices as a more innocent blood mage, not a contradiction in terms, as it turns out, and a fast-talking rogue. Isabella has a very Zevron-esque charm about her, actually, whereas Meryl is very much the opposite of both Wynne and Morrigan in different ways. We also meet Varric, a fan-favorite, non-romanceable companion, who ends up being quite the charmer and rather relevant to the game's main story to a strong degree. The first male romanceable companion is Fenris, a quite provocative personality to have in Dragon Age 2, specifically owing to his history as a slave and his negative disposition towards mages. But the second male romanceable companion is who we're here to talk about today, as you might have guessed if you've played. When you first find Anders, he's helping Ferelden refugees and working as a healer. It's the kind of narrative position that makes him amenable to both players of the first game, who have reason to like the Grey Wardens, as well as players of Origins' DLC, who will remember him. However, it also presents him immediately as a trustworthy person for Hawke, whose status as a former Ferelden refugee almost immediately aligns the two characters. This is well because the characters you will have necessarily met thus far are Bethany or Carver, depending on whether you play as a warrior or rogue or a mage, which dictates whether your mage sibling or warrior sibling will survive the prologue, in addition to the subsequent early encounters with Aveline, Varric, and probably also Meryl. The last characters to join my party in almost every playthrough are Anders, Fenris, and Isabella, which means that if you do Anders' introductory quest either last or earliest in the middle of the pack, either way you're likely to have some options for bringing pro-Templar and pro-Mage characters on this quest and any subsequent quests with Anders. I fully plan on talking about Dragon Age and its associated themes and philosophical ideas at a later date, probably once I've completed other projects, especially the ones dealing with Greedfall and the Borderlands series, so I'd like to leave off some relevant discussions about blood magic and its relationship to the narrative of Dragon Age 2. But that's not to say that Anders doesn't have a lot to do with magic and its associated themes and ideas in this game. There's a scene in Anders' first real quest that always stuck with me as a queer person. Anders discloses very little of this quest to the player, but they meet outside the chantry and find Anders' former friend and lover within. Carl has been made tranquil, a rite which strips a mage of not only their connection to the Fade, but also any real emotions of significant strength, of their ability to think and feel and dream as they once did. In this mission we see the demon or spirit of justice emerge from Anders as wrathful vengeance. There's something about Anders that has festered in my mind ever since I played this video game when I was around about 17 years old. Anders always came off extreme and a bit of a hard-ass, and I never quite understood why he didn't see things more like some of the other characters did. Granted, Dragon Age 2 does everything in its narrative power to get the player to sympathize with the mages, and I certainly did. But while I found Anders sympathetic, empathy was something it took me time and living to reach. Anders, like Zevron, wasn't the reason I got the idea to make this little series of essays, but he does make sense as a fixture within it because of what changed within me during that time. As an adult, when I look back now, with not quite double the life experience as I had back then, I think I understand Anders a lot better. When he says, "You will never harm another mage," there's a part of me that understands what that means to him, because the rite of tranquility in this metaphorical context is not unlike the chemical castration that gay men historically faced and still sometimes face in some places. Anders lost someone very close to him, and Carl lost a part of himself, an essential part that he truly deeply felt he could not live without. There have been many, many times when I've seen another queer person get hurt, abused, and targeted like that, it's actually a huge part of why I use the word queer so much, and I feel intensely that exact same thought. I want so desperately to be able to say, not one more, you will never hurt one of us ever again, even though at some level I know it's not true. The hairline transformation of justice into vengeance is fully comprehensible to a person who has lived just enough to feel that conflation happened within ourselves, to identify it, to interrogate it, to wrestle with it. Anders is a character who wrestles with that same inner conflict. It's an ironic feeling because outwardly, people like Anders never present as conflicted, or they don't read like that to those who don't know. I know I personally have spent a lot of time being interrogated by people who feel it's their obligation to knock me down a peg or two for my being so outwardly confident, or at least that's the reason they give. Anders has that nuance to him as well, I think. Outwardly, he's a zealot. Inwardly, he's in pain. When characters banter with him, especially Fenris, but also sometimes Varric, they tend to take the posture of that ironically more worldly cynic who doubts the zealot's overconfidence. Part of my empathy for Anders is that I've come to understand why those remarks don't faze him. True, the others haven't all seen what he's seen and experienced what he's experienced, but moreover their pessimism that his ideals are too lofty and ungrounded is ironically exactly the kind of feeling he has about his own worldview, only inverted. To someone like Anders, the inevitability of his own sense of justice totally defeats that empty cynicism. Fenris thinks freedom for mages can't possibly be a good idea, but Anders knows the only impossibility is for things to continue on as they have. This is how the ideology of the pessimist actually creates the ideology of the revolutionary. Varric will actually warn us off of dating Anders. It's pretty funny since he's the one telling this story, so his bias grants the most meta-level knowledge of what actually happened and why. I'd like to think he's editorializing a little bit, writing what he wished he had said to Hawke, given what he knows now. It's in the third game that all his foreshadowing really comes to a head. Dragon Age 2 is a game about several things at once, but cleverly, the themes are chiefly divided among its quests in a way that allow its ideas to emerge in each act with greater clarity. What's implicit in Act 1 becomes explicit in Act 2. After that, we're left to allow the remaining pieces to fall into place, and Anders is chief among those pieces. Dragon Age 2, as opposed to automatically speccing your companions into a particular specialization tree that the player could also specialize in, actually gives a unique upgrade tree for each companion in addition to the basic ones. Additionally, each character gets a bonus based on whether the player character has a overall positive or negative relationship with them. Negative relationships can also pan out in betrayals. For example, in this playthrough where both Isabella and Fenris betrayed my Hawke. By contrast, Bethany survived and is the only companion to not have a unique upgrade tree. But Anders can get bonuses to health regeneration if Hawke has a rivalry with him, or bonuses to elemental types if Hawke has a friendship with him. Because in this run I was going for friendship by necessity, I also decided to spec Anders into ice and rock spells that allow for crowd control effects, with the rest of his points going into healing and defensive abilities. This actually makes Anders quite strong when paired with a strong damage dealer and a strong tank, which Varric and my player character filled nicely. Unfortunately, because the other two melee DPS characters betrayed me, I needed to swap between Aveline, Meryl, and Bethany at the end of the game, which either lowered our damage or our total health pool and our ability to draw aggro from enemies. I ended up using Bethany more after some testing because speccing her into some damage spells, as well as some crowd control spells, allowed the greatest possible ability to control the flow of battle, given Meryl is more of a pure damage dealer and Aveline is more of a pure tank. Naturally, I sided with the mages in the end, but I still had to proactively forgive Anders out of pure love and defeat Orsino before Meredith. In that final fight, a bunch of characters we had helped over the game showed up to help us, and, of all people, this included Zevran from our first playthrough. It was nice to see him again, and created a kind of continuity between these essays, but it also reminded me of how different Zevran and Anders are. The metatextual meaning of Anders' struggle is seriously the farthest thing from Zevran's devil-may-care attitude towards politics and interpersonal relationships alike. Anders tells Hawke that they can build a world where no one has to die for being how the Maker made them. The parallels to real-world queer liberation struggle couldn't be more stark and in our face than that. What this also does is draw a provocative line between the frankly anti-Semitic ideas about blood ritual and sacrifice, as well as the abducting of children and the need for religious regulation that obviously parallels real-world Christian history and ideals, and that line follows all the way through to real-world parallels between anti-Semitic ideas and the persecution of queer minorities. It's an open secret that right-wing ideas about what it means to be transgender, for example, have followed this playbook. The trans lobby, or the trans activists, or the trans whoever, are here to take your children, to chop off their breasts or genitals, to inject them with sterilizing drugs, to draw them into a radical ideology that victimizes our vulnerable women and pushes a Marxist and/or Luciferian agenda, to push the sexual victimization of children by first presenting them with inappropriate ideas, words, and images about sexuality, to turn them away from God, to push them towards Satanism, and maybe even collaborate with trafficking and ritual sacrifice, or so we're told. In reality, this is nonsense, but it's nonsense with a real history. You may also be aware of the history of the Satanic Panic in America, which included real conspiracies of queer people engaged in inappropriate relationships with children, and even drawing them into physically impossible situations and ritual sacrifice of animals, or blood ritual. Learning about things like the McMartin conspiracy blew my brain wide open to the true extent of reactionary American Christian delusion about queer people, up to, but not limited to, a frankly pathological obsession with the private parts of children and, ironically, the coaching of children into false testimony. There are still people who champion those conspiracy theories despite them being entirely debunked, although not according to their outdated arguments, and they tend to frame these conspiracies as elements of a larger pattern of a hidden culture of ritual abuse. The implications for art about queerness, blood ritual, sacrifice, political radicalism, and rebellion against institutions with Christian parallels — Andraste is really a fusion of Jesus Christ and Joan of Arc after all — are totally crystal clear. I couldn't have made it more blatant if I wrote it myself. I'd honestly be shocked if this was universally unintended by all the writers of all these games. By some, maybe, but by all? I wonder. Ultimately, it doesn't really matter. The game is what it is, and it has what it has. A strong through line of content displaying powerful ideas about queer persecution. These ideas about anti-Semitism will be the subject for a future essay, but I wanted to touch on them here because they're fundamentally why I empathize with Anders. Players have sometimes complained about how his deception feels like a betrayal, or how his character changed from his original appearance in the Dragon Age Origins DLC. I suppose I empathize, but I think it's clear why he changes, and that's precisely why I empathize with him. He's an archetype, to be sure, but he contains a powerful set of ideals about the world that queer people and other minority groups inhabit. A world that turns against them, a world that maligns them, a world that takes their all-too-human potential to do wrong and attributes it to their difference as opposed to their commonality, their shared humanity. This world takes and it takes, but we have strength beyond strength. That is what I see in Anders. That is what I see in all of you. You are beautiful. You are powerful. Never forget that, and never let anything try to change it. The only thing you have to lose is yourself. The greatest potential we have for liberty is in precisely those pieces of us they want to destroy.